In recent years, there has been a resurgence in the rise in the popularity of indie horror games, reaching mass appeal, with larger AAA companies taking notice of the possibilities through the explorative elements being portrayed in many of these experimental titles. The unusual elements are more noticeable with the unnerving aspects seen in low-poly horror video games. This video will look at the aspects surrounding the rise of low-poly horror games and how they are inspiring and introducing a new generation to the scary elements of this unique style of video games that date back to the early days of 3D games development of the 90s. Low-poly horror games, also known as low-fidelity or retro-styled horror titles, are a subgenre of games that use simple and stylized graphics and visuals to create an unsettling and immersive atmosphere. These games often use a minimalist art style and simple geometry to create environments and characters that evoke a sense of unease and fear. One of the unique aspects of low-poly horror games is how they can use limited graphical styles to create a sense of uncertainty and ambiguity among the player. With fewer visual cues to guide the player, the imagination is often left to fill in the blanks, which can make the experience more terrifying. Additionally, the low fidelity graphics and texture warping can also serve to disorient the player, making it more difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is imagined. Low-poly horror games also push the boundaries of game development and storytelling by emphasizing atmosphere, mood, and player experience over photorealistic graphics. They can often use procedurally generated content and adaptive sound design to enhance the sense of unease and provide a unique experience for each playthrough. Themes like isolation, helplessness, and uncertainty can also be explored to a deeper level with these kinds of games. Overall, low-poly horror games provide a unique and immersive way to experience horror, which leaves an emotional impact on players as they push the boundaries of game development and storytelling. These games feature simple, blocky graphics that belie their ability to create a sense of unease and dread in the player, and it's no surprise to see why low-poly horror games continue to rise in popularity, as looking back over the early 3D era and console generation of the 90s with the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, Panasonic 3DO and PC gaming managed to utilise these elements to great effect, even with the limiting aspects of the hardware and software available during that time. Iconic titles with Resident Evil and Silent Hill, along with rarer games such as Hellnight, made full use of these limiting factors to provide intense, tension-filled experiences that always pique curiosity and uncertainty within the player, forcing them to explore and utilise whatever means possible to survive. It is these limiting factors that would inspire creators to develop ideas to create some of the most groundbreaking titles ever seen in the video game industry. One of the early pioneers of the low-poly horror game movement was Slender, the 8 pages, released in 2012, putting you in the role of the player searching for 8 pages scattered in a dense forest, while being pursued by the malevolent entity known as the Slender Man. The game was a viral hit, and its success inspired a number of other indie developers to create their own low-poly horror games. Another popular game, while not using low-poly visuals but more 2D pixelated graphics, is Lone Survivor, also released in 2012 by Jasper Byrne. The game is a psychological horror title where the player is a lone survivor of a mysterious outbreak and must survive by navigating a series of interconnected areas while avoiding monstrous creatures and conserving limited resources. This game was proof that it wasn't just low-poly games that could provide these tense elements, but lesser known games could also invoke similar elements of fear and uncertainty if you present a well thought out idea or concept. Low-poly horror games have also been used as a medium to tell stories from different perspectives, with many enthusiasts and upcoming developers making use of this unique style to create concepts and prototypes of unusual experiences quickly, which you can often find on various gaming marketplaces with itch.io, GameJolt and Steam, to allow fans to play and leave feedback, hopefully to spark enough interest to venture further into these ideas to develop finished examples, many of which do reach a level of completion and are often seen as the main selling points of these marketplaces. Manto from Chilla Arts is one of these examples that looks at a game about a Japanese urban legend, a masked spirit that wears a red cloak and who appears to people using public or school restrooms. The game tells the story of a student exploring an old school late at night to see if the myths are real, only to discover that it is very real, where they must run, hide, explore and solve puzzles while defending themselves in any way possible to survive and escape alive. The low poly aesthetic of these games allows for a sense of unease to be created through their minimalistic design and limited details. The use of simple graphics also allows for a greater sense of player immersion, as the player is able to use their own imagination to fill in the gaps left by the visuals of their surroundings. Harvest Season is a short horror experience inspired by B-movie horror films about a combine harvester that has been possessed by an evil spirit and is hungry to harvest some flesh. You must navigate the corn maze and avoid the killer combine while picking up ammo for your shotgun to fight it off or try to get as far away as possible. You need to find the exit or destroy the combine harvester to escape. But the big question is, will you escape or will you prevail in destroying this terrifying machine? Lake Haven is a PS1 style horror game following the role of a detective, Zeke Renauld, as he investigates an unusual case surrounding the death of a young woman while being entwined in a series of events that will drastically alter the course of his life forever. As you play, you uncover many truths and clues that surround the death of the young woman, while many question it as a suicide or even murder, or is there something else more sinister behind it all. This is a very unique style indie horror game that takes much inspiration from iconic survival horror titles of the 32-bit era with Silent Hill and Resident Evil that utilise dynamic and fixed camera perspectives with low poly 3D visuals that look very similar to the first Silent Hill game on the original PlayStation console, which provides an unnerving sense of tension, leaving for a very surreal experience. The game challenges many mediums and ideas while looking into elements of murder, suicide and mental health to understand many psychological aspects, to solve puzzles and tell the game's story. Despite the relative simplicity of these games, they have proven to be highly effective at creating a sense of tension and dread in the player, making low-poly horror games a rising trend in the world of gaming. Low-poly horror games have been heavily influenced by classic horror video games of the past. Games like Resident Evil, Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve, Overblood, Deep Fear, Hellnight, and Alone in the Dark have set the standard for survival horror in the gaming industry and have served as inspiration for many low-poly horror games seen today. To look at these elements in more context, Resident Evil popularised the survival horror genre, and its use of fixed camera angles, limited inventory and puzzles have influenced many gameplay dynamics that would add a level of interactivity, forcing the player to implement various strategies while understanding what they must focus on and what is necessary for survival. Dino Crisis and Parasite Eve have a similar style of gameplay with a focus on survival, limited resources and enemies that cannot be killed easily, with Dino Crisis focusing more on tension and jump scares, while Parasite Eve implements RPG leveling systems with a slower approach to the gameplay that focuses on making the player feel tension through the use of vivid storytelling. Overblood and Hellnight also use a similar approach with their focus on survival, limited resources and atmospheric horror. Alone in the Dark was another key influence with its focus on storytelling, atmosphere and puzzle solving, and it is considered to be one of the first true survival horror games, and its influence is evident in many low-poly horror games that use a similar approach of storytelling, atmosphere and puzzle solving, that would also prove as one of the largest influences for the original Resident Evil games on the PlayStation. With these elements, it is easy to see why this visual style of game is so popular, as these classic horror games have influenced the low-poly aesthetic in a way that it gave birth to a more minimalist approach, focusing on atmosphere, exploration and puzzles. The limiting aspects of the visuals, draw distance and texture warping are able to draw the player into the atmospheric nature on offer and invoke many different emotions and feelings that modern games with superior visuals often struggle to replicate. Overall, the legacy of these classic horror video games lives on through the low-poly horror titles of today, as the influence of these games can be seen in many aspects of modern examples, from the gameplay mechanics to the use of atmosphere and storytelling, that provides a legacy which continues to shape the way we experience horror in video games. The rise of low-poly horror video games continues to be a growing trend in the gaming industry, as more developers are experimenting with the unique aesthetic and gameplay possibilities that are on offer. As the popularity of low-poly horror games begins to rise, more and more big-budget studios are also starting to take notice and incorporate these aesthetics into their own horror titles. This combination of a popular franchise with a new aesthetic has been praised by critics and players alike, further solidifying the place of low-poly horror games in mainstream gaming. The rise of low-poly horror games also has a broader impact on the industry, as it shows that good storytelling, atmosphere and gameplay can be achieved without relying on high-fidelity graphics. It also allows smaller indie game development teams to produce horror games with limited budgets and resources. In addition, many low-poly horror games take inspiration from classic horror movies, books and games to give them a new look and feel, which allows for a new generation of players to experience the horror stories that have shaped the genre for decades. As the popularity of this trend continues to rise, we can expect to see even more creative and terrifying games in the future. From indie to big budget studios, horror games are experimenting and pushing the boundaries of what is possible within the low-poly aesthetic, and it's exciting to see where the genre will go next. Low-poly visuals, stylized graphics, simple geometry, texture warping all contribute to making a game look creepy and adding an eerie and unsettling atmosphere to create a sense of uncertainty and ambiguity, which can be unsettling to make the player feel uneasy. The use of simple shapes, colours and textures can also create a sense of nostalgia and familiarity, but with a twist that makes it feel unfamiliar and eerie. Texture warping is a technique that is often used in low-poly games to create a sense of unease, which involves distorting textures in a way that makes them look stretched or twisted, which can be disorientating and contribute to a sense of unease. This effect can be used on backgrounds, characters or objects to make them look off or wrong, and help to build a feeling of dread. No other visual style can master these aesthetics, as texture warping can make a game look very creepy by creating so much atmosphere that it is both unfamiliar and familiar all at the same time, which distorts the player's perception of the environment in a way that makes it feel so unsettling. This can help to create a unique immersive experience that is unlike anything found in traditional high-fidelity horror games. The viewing distance of the player's environments was also limited, as the hardware wasn't capable of drawing or rendering all of the visible aspects in each section on older hardware, leaving only pure darkness until you move closer to them, which is very different from modern games, as you have a far greater field of view. But in older games, seen on consoles like the original PlayStation and Sega Saturn, this was simply not possible. Later on, game developers would learn to use fog to mask or hide many of the undrawn or non-rendered elements until you moved closer to them, which created a heightened sense of tension never witnessed before in games. With titles such as Silent Hill, released in 1999, that would make full use of these effects to create one of the most immersive and scariest games of all time. These elements were proven to be so popular that the fogging tricks used in Silent Hill would go on to be used in many horror games that are still being developed to this day. When we look at games like Manto from Chill Arts that immerse the player in a world filled with suspense, navigating narrow hallways and rooms while being chased when trying to hide and escape from an evil entity that constantly pursues you, will always leave you feeling uneasy, as it isn't just the fact that you are trying to avoid the assailant, but you have to contend with the chilling vibe and atmosphere that is portrayed from the low poly visuals with the texture warping and fog that only increase the tension as you play, which provides a very chilling experience. The rise of low poly horror video games has opened up new opportunities for developers, as well as providing players with a unique and immersive gaming experience that defies traditional graphical expectations. Another aspect of the rise of low poly horror games is the way they use the minimalistic approach to storytelling and world building. With limited graphics, developers have to rely more on the player's imagination and subtle cues to create an eerie atmosphere and build tension. This minimalist approach also allows for a greater sense of player exploration, as the player is often left to discover the backstory and lore of the game's world on their own, where they must pay attention to the little details in the environment and piece together what happened before, which can create a real sense of unease. Additionally, low poly horror games often have a focus of ambient sound and music, which can be highly effective in creating a sense of tension and unease. In addition, the limited graphics also help to create an eerie silence, and when something jumps out, the sudden burst of sound can be all the more panic-inducing and unsettling.
Excuse me.
Low poly horror games are also highly replayable, as their minimalist approach and lack of traditional cutscenes means that players can experience a story and atmosphere in a different way each time they play. This leads to a more immersive and personal experience that can be more terrifying than anything that could be presented through cutscenes. Overall, low poly horror games are not only just a rising trend in the gaming industry, but they also represent a new and innovative approach to the game development and storytelling techniques. As the popularity of these games continues to grow, it's exciting to see how this genre will evolve in the future. With the eerie atmosphere, subtle storytelling and focus on player exploration and immersion, low poly horror games are proving to be a formidable force in the world of gaming, and one that will continue to shape the future of horror gaming long into the future. Low poly horror games also have a unique way of creating an emotional connection with the game's protagonist and with the story. The simplicity of the graphics allows players to project themselves more easily into the game, and as a result, they can relate to the main character more easily. In many of these games, the protagonist is often a regular person in an extraordinary situation than a highly trained or skilled character. This allows players to identify with the main character and experience the fear, stress and vulnerability that they are going through as they struggle to adapt to the situation and the environments they find themselves in. Additionally, this minimalistic approach and adaptation to the character's mindset and background also allows for a greater emphasis on the psychological aspect of the horror, as it can play havoc with your mind. These elements often rely on the player's own fears and imagination to create a sense of unease and dread, which can be even more effective than traditional jump scares. Furthermore, low poly horror games often require players to make difficult moral decisions, which can lead to an emotional investment in the story. This can be especially effective in games that have a strong narrative and that leave a lasting impact on the player long after the game is over. In conclusion, low poly horror games are not only providing a new and an exciting way to experience horror games, but are also pushing the boundaries of what is possible in games development, ideas and storytelling, giving players a truly immersive experience that leaves a lasting impression and creates an emotional connection to the game's protagonist and of the story. One reason for this is the simple stylized visuals of low poly horror games that can be used to create a wide variety of game genres, not just horror. For example, low poly visual elements are often used to create adventure games, puzzle games, and even first person shooters. Another reason that low poly games could have a promising future is that they can be easier and cheaper to develop than high fidelity games. The low fidelity graphics can be created quickly and with minimal resources, which makes it possible for small teams and even individual developers to create high quality games, presenting a unique charm and appeal that can't be replicated by bigger budget or more realistic looking games. They can create a sense of nostalgia that can attract a specific audience looking for that type of immersion and atmosphere within the games they play. It's also possible that low poly games will continue to be popular on mobile devices and online platforms like Steam, where players are looking for shorter, more immersive experiences that can be played in bite-sized chunks. itch.io is another excellent platform where you can find and play many of these game examples and prototypes that could also provide inspiration for you to develop your own gaming concepts. Overall, low poly games seem to be a promising trend in games development, with the potential to be used in a wide variety of genres to attract a different audience and be more accessible for small teams to develop new ideas. And with the resurgence in popularity in recent years, it's possible that this trend will continue in the future. But all of these elements would not have been possible without the resurgence of classic survival horror in recent years, which you can learn more about by checking out this next video to discover the reasons behind why horror games are becoming popular once again.